Welcome to another episode of On the History Trail. I'm your host and tour guide, Mark Nonestied. On today's episode, we're going to take a walking tour of the Old Bridge Historic District. We're going to get a chance to look at some of the old buildings that make up this unique neighborhood, and we'll get a chance to actually go inside one and take a peek and explore it. So sit back and relax and follow me as we travel on the History Trail. Behind me is the old Simpson Methodist Church. This was one of two churches that were located here in the township's historic district. The other was a Baptist church. The congregation, the Methodist congregation, was formed about 1860, and the building itself was built about 1862, and still retains a lot of original architectural elements from that time period, both on the outside of the building and on the interior as well. Some early ornate plasterwork from the mid-19th century. In 1980, when the congregation had ceased to exist at this location, the building became the East Brunswick Museum, and today contains a wonderful collection of artifacts from East Brunswick and the surrounding communities. And recently, within the last 5 years, the building was repainted to its original color scheme from the mid-1800s, this white with dark green shutters and trim. One of the great things about the historic district is the diversity of homes that are located here. There are buildings that date from the 1700s all the way up through to the 1920s and 30s, so there's this great evolution of architecture that can be found in this neighborhood. The house behind me is one of 3 Sears and Roebuck kit homes that exist in the historic district. These were houses that were purchased through a Sears and Roebuck mail order catalog. And Sears sold houses between 1908, roughly until about the time of World War II. The house behind me was built in the 1920s and cost roughly $1,500 to buy at the time. These homes were shipped as a kit to the location, so all you needed to do was have an empty lot and the house could be shipped to that location, and then it came with the blueprints and all the instructions to build your own home. Behind me is the Rogers homestead. This is one of about half a dozen buildings here in the historic district that date from the 1700s. Parts of this home were built in the late 1700s. In the 1900s, it was owned by William and Adeline Rogers, and believe it or not, they raised 10 children in this house. There were 8 girls and 2 boys. Architecturally, what we're looking at is the back of an earlier home. Historically, the house was oriented to face Chestnut Street, but by the 1860s, the 1870s, they added the cross gable, that peak that you see in the roof line, and at one time there was a front porch on the house, and it was oriented so that it would face this open yard instead of the street. So we're going to get a chance to go inside and take a look at this historic house. So why don't you follow me on in? We're inside the hallway of the Rogers house, and there's a table here that pays homage to the previous owners of the home. This is a photograph of William Rogers. William Rogers was the captain of a sailing vessel, a sloop, which was a single-masted sailing vessel, and he transported farm produce that was grown in East Brunswick and the surrounding regions to the big markets in New York City. He also transported other material, as is evident by this. This is a copy of a receipt from April 26th. Can't quite make out the year, but from Mr. Cornelius Lamberton. And it says, "Dear Sir, please pay to Captain Culver." This is Daniel Culver, who was also in business with William Rogers. "The sum due for this load of night soil, and this shall be your receipt." And it's signed Captain William Rogers. This is a photograph of his wife. This is Adeline Rogers. And as I mentioned earlier, she had 10 children, and this 8 girls and 2 boys. And this is a photograph of one of their boys, also named William Rogers. William was born in this house in 1841, and he went off to fight in the Civil War, and unfortunately was killed at the Battle of Chancellorsville in 1863. And there is a marker at the top of Chestnut Hill Cemetery that commemorates him in the center of the Rogers family plot. Within the last 10 years, the house has been restored back to its original appearance. This is a photograph before restoration work took place here in the hallway that showed a bathroom that was located right here in the corner near the door. There was a wall that spanned between this door frame and this door frame over to here, with a doorway right here which you would enter into the bathroom, and there was a sink that was here. And there was paneling that covered up the wall. And believe it or not, this door and parts of this transom light were covered underneath the paneling. So as the paneling was peeled back, some of the original molding and the original door and doorway became apparent. Okay, architecturally, the house, or this section of the house, is what's known as a Federal style. This was a style of architecture that was popular between about 1790 to about 1810, 1820. And it's characterized by this very light-looking feel. There's lots of natural light that comes into the hallway. We can see the transom light that's above the doorway, which allows light to come in. And then there is a window at the top of the stair landing that also lets in natural light. And we can see some of the other characteristics of the Federal style. Very simple design. It's not bulky and heavy as the previous Georgian style in the 1700s. We have these very simple, tapered, squared newel post here at the bottom of the staircase, a simple tapered newel post, and these square balusters are all characteristics of Federal style architecture, and a very simple rounded handrail also of mahogany wood. And historically there was a chair rail that mimicked the rise of the handrail here. This was recently replicated and restored. And if you join me at the top of the steps, there's a section of the wall that's been left open so we can look at the original building style and construction of the house. So why don't you follow me upstairs? There's a section of the wall here that's been left open to show how the house was constructed. This home is what we call timber framing. It's where they use these massive pieces of timber in order to build the house. And you can see they're hand cut. If we look at them carefully, we can see all these marks across the surface of the lumber that were made by an axe, sort of squaring it off so that it could be used as a structural piece. The pieces are then fitted together with other structural pieces and then pegged. And each mortise and tendon joint was made specifically to fit into one another. And if we look closely at it, we can see the wooden peg right here. And right next to the wooden peg, there's the Roman numeral 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. There's 4 hatch marks that line up with 4 hatch marks, 4 Roman numeral here on this beam. So this piece was meant specifically to fit into this piece, and then it was pegged. And there's also a little arrow that's carved onto the top of the piece so that when they're assembling the house, they know that this section is meant to go up towards the top. Right below it is what's called brick noggin. This is a form of insulation. It's brick that's in all the walls of the house, and it was a very early form of insulation. We can also see lath, and this is what the plaster adheres to. We have some very early riven or hand-split lath here, and the plaster would then be applied over this. And at some point around the early 1900s, there was a chair rail that ran along this section that was taken out and then patched in. And we can see some later lath located right here that has saw cut marks on it. It's not hand split. That was used to patch in the area where they pulled out the old chair rail and plastered it over. And of course this chair rail here was just placed in here recently to replicate the old chair rail that once ran through here. And there's also some other remnants here. This is what's called the scratch coat. This is the first coat of plaster that goes on, and then the white plaster is placed right over this, and then the walls are painted or papered and finished off. This building was originally built as a one-room schoolhouse in the 1840s, and historically was located further up the street from the location that it's in now. Around the early 1900s, the building was lifted up and actually moved down to its current location and was converted from a schoolhouse into a residence. And for many years, this was the home of Bill and Martha Kramer. Bill Kramer moved to this area about 1910. He passed away in the 1990s. And for many years he was a friend of the East Brunswick Museum and a local historian, and collected a lot of historical information about the neighborhood. Historically, when this was a schoolhouse, the first teacher was a woman named Sarah Chittick, whose grandson, Murray Chittick, would later become the superintendent of schools in East Brunswick, who Chittick School is named after. And she was a school teacher here in the mid-1800s. In the 1890s, this building was the subject of a painting by James Crawford Tom, who was a local but well-known artist. The painting, called Winter in Oldbridge, showed school children leaving the school on a winter's day in the 1890s and coming out from the school building, and some of the mischievous students are starting a snowball fight. The painting today hangs at the East Brunswick Museum and is a prominent part of the collection at the building. We're on Cosman Street. Historically, this road was known as Willow Street. And behind me is the home, or was the home, of Hannah Disbrow. It was built about 1871. And Hannah Disbrow was a local dressmaker. She made clothing items for some of the residents that lived here in the neighborhood. The house has been lovingly cared for many years by John and Alberta Uhas, who purchased the house about 1940 and continued to maintain it and live in the house. Out front is this wonderful hitching post, which is about 100 years old. And this was an area where horses could be tied up to and tethered to the hitching post so that you could get off and visit Hannah Disbrow and then come back out, and the horse would be hitched up to the hitching post here. And at one time, historically, there were many of these that were located along Cosman Street. This was the home of Rachel Slover Wright. Rachel's daughter, Henrietta, grew up in this house. Henrietta was a well-known children's author. She wrote books in the 1880s and 90s. And Rachel outlived all of her children, only to be murdered in this house on Good Friday in 1906. It was an unsolved crime. Nobody was ever caught from it. And at the time, there was a reward of $500 that could help lead to the capture and conviction, hopefully, of the people that had done it. But unfortunately, no information came about because of it, and it still to this day remains an unsolved mystery. This brick structure was built in 1908, and this was the third public schoolhouse here in the Oldbridge neighborhood. The building replaced an earlier two-room wooden school building, and prior to that, this was the location of the first one-room schoolhouse here in the neighborhood, which was built here in the 1840s and subsequently moved down the street to its location that we saw earlier. This brick building housed 4 classrooms, 2 on each level, and there was a basement area. It was a kindergarten through 8th grade and was originally known as Oldbridge School Number 3 until the 1930s, when the name changed to Crandall School in honor of Joseph Crandall, who was a young boy who lived in this neighborhood and was killed in 1918 during World War I. The principal of this school many years ago was Murray Chittick, who would go on to become the superintendent of schools in East Brunswick. At one time, for the safety of the students, there was a fire escape that was located on the side of the building, except it was in the form of a slide. It was like a chute that spiraled down to the bottom, and it was housed in this silo-type structure. And you can imagine the children loved their fire drills. Up on the second floor, there was a door that they would hop into, or open up and then hop into the chute and be spun around on their way down to the bottom and out for safety. The teachers usually sent the boys down first, and then the boys got wise as to why this was so, and it was because they wanted to clean the slide out so the girls' dresses didn't get dirty. But many of the boys picked up on this, and halfway down the slide they would stick their arms and legs out and get purposely stuck inside the tube, waiting for the girls and the teachers to come right behind them. The building hasn't been used as a school in many decades and fell into disrepair, and recently it was being purchased, and the outside of the building is being maintained to its original character, and the inside of the building is being converted into condominiums. The Old Bridge Baptist Church behind me historically was known as the Independent Bethel Baptist Church. The congregation was founded about 1840, and this building was built in 1844. Historically, the building faced a different direction. It faced the road that runs alongside it today. And legend has it that after Sunday services, there was a pigsty that was across the street, and they thought this was a horrible way to end their services. And in 1893, the building was lifted up, and the front of it was turned to face Cosman Street. About 1893, in the 1890s, the stained glass windows were added, and today are over 100 years old. And in the early 1990s, the front of the building was extended out slightly to come closer towards Cosman Street to provide an accessible entrance. At the time, there was a cornerstone in the side of the building dated 1893, and we can go over and take a look at it. And when they removed it, they found a time capsule inside that was placed there over 100 years ago. Here on the side of the building, we can see this cornerstone dated 1893, which doesn't commemorate the year that the church was built, but it commemorates the year that the building was moved. Historically, the building sat low to the ground, and the front of it faced the street that runs alongside of it today. And in 1893, they oriented it towards Cosman Street. They put this large foundation on, which provided rooms beneath the sanctuary. And in the early 1990s, they added on to the front of the building. You can see the different colored bricks here. And in order for the date to be read, they had to pull the block out and turn it so that it faced this side and wasn't going to be covered up with the addition. And when they did so, and they pulled this block out, they found a time capsule inside of here that was placed over 100 years ago at the time. And it contained some coins. There were newspapers from the 1890s that were placed inside of here. And they have those records here at the church, and then they placed their own time capsule inside of here and placed it back in the block when they reset it in the foundation. The Old Bridge section of East Brunswick is located at the head of navigation for the South River. And behind me is the South River, and it was at this point, this is the farthest point on the South River, that you could navigate a boat. And in the 1700s and 1800s, there were a number of sailing vessels that could sail up this far up the South River and pick up farm produce, wood, and other goods from East Brunswick and the surrounding areas, load them onto the boats at the docks along the South River, and then these sailing vessels would sail down the South River, out to the Raritan River, out to Raritan Bay, and then onward to New York City, where the big markets were. And that is one of the unique reasons behind this area and why this area developed. It's unlike other sections of East Brunswick, which was rural, agricultural-based economy. Here, their jobs were centered around the river. Some of them owned sailing vessels, Some of them owned mills where produce was processed or wheat grind into flour. Some of them owned stores which sold some of the goods that were coming in and out of the neighborhood. And that's why this area developed as a community, and unlike other sections of East Brunswick, which were primarily agricultural. Well, I hope you enjoyed this episode as we explored the history of the Old Bridge Historic District, located right here in East Brunswick Township, and that you got the opportunity to learn about the history of these historic homes here and about the history of this area. Until next time, I'm your host and tour guide, Mark Nonestied, and please join me again as we travel on the History Trail.